Hi, welcome back to another episode of Nobody's Doing It Right, the podcast for those who are uncertain. I'm Kat, I'm your host. Today's episode is going to be about ease and flow, and how if this thing that you want requires that much force, then maybe it's just not meant to work. And this is something that I've had to kind of come to terms with for myself. It's something I still struggle with, right? Because I think, especially for those of us who are people pleasers, when something is difficult, it's almost like a challenge to us. We take it as a challenge to prove ourselves and prove our worth by making it work. So when we are faced with something that is difficult, that is just not flowing, that is not just, it's not meeting us halfway, we feel like, oh, perfect. This is our opportunity to show that we are good enough to get to this thing. Of course, this pushes on a lot of childhood wounds of trauma, of not being good enough, of maybe having to prove yourself growing up. It's like the perfect combination. It's the perfect storm, basically, and works wonderfully with any kind of trauma of that sort, to be faced with things that are not easy, that just don't flow. Now, of course, everything in life requires work and effort, right? Of course, like you can't completely do nothing and expect something. But it doesn't always need to be forceful. It doesn't always need to feel like you are constantly struggling to get this thing. And if you do feel that, if you feel like, okay, I have to plan this out and I have to strategize and I have to do this, I have to change myself, I have to be more like this to make it work, then maybe it's just not meant to work. And it's important that when we are faced with these things, that we don't take it lightly, that we don't try and double down on this thing that is not flowing and try to make it work and try to convince ourselves that we could get it if we just did something different, or if we worked a little bit harder, or if we approached it from this angle or whatever. Because when we do that, when we double down on these things that are just not aligned with us, it's just not aligned. Because if it was aligned, it would be aligned. It would flow. When we double down on that, we're just telling ourselves subconsciously that we don't deserve things that are easeful for us, that are willing to meet us halfway, that are willing to just be there, without us having to force it to happen, to try and bend ourselves or mold ourselves to fit into whatever this thing is. And I feel like I've mentioned this before in my podcast or even some videos maybe, but this is something I remember from my childhood when I was in my grade 10 photography class. And I remember when we were learning to use our 35mm film cameras, our teacher told us, anything on it, any buttons, any flips or switches or whatever, don't force it. He's like, if you force it, it will break. If you notice that there is a level of resistance to this thing that is, that you're trying to push on or open or whatever, don't force it. You will break the camera. And I've actually taken that with me to this very day. Now, of course, resistance is not always a sign of it not working or there not being any flow or it not being aligned, right? It depends on what's behind the resistance ultimately. But when it comes down to it, right, anything that requires you to push too much, to push out of fear, right? Because resistance is I think different, right? Like if you are faced with resistance towards something, but you keep circling back to it because you're like, this is inherently aligned with me, like this thing. And the reason that I'm resistant is because I know that to get to the other side of this resistance, I have to push myself out of the fears that I have that are holding me back, right? Those fears being rooted in any sort of, other childhood trauma or anything that you've been conditioned to believe is true, right? Pushing yourself out of those self-limiting beliefs, right? That resistance, yeah, you do have to push through that. You do have to force yourself in a sense. But it's coming from a different place than the resistance of something that is just not aligned with you, because if you have to change yourself in ways that are not aligned with you to make this thing work, you're going to break it. You're going to break yourself in the process, and you're going to break whatever it is that you're trying to do, right? So let's say, as an example, if it's a relationship, you meet somebody, you start seeing them, there are some great qualities, sure. There's some level of oh yeah, this is fun, this is enjoyable, we do vibe on a certain level. But then you notice with time, you have to force yourself or force things to work in place. Maybe they are less available to you. They aren't showing up in the way that you would want them to show up. So you think, okay, well, maybe if I start approaching our text messages this way, then they'll show up. Or maybe if I am just more comfortable with not having as much communication or contact, then it'll work for us. Then I can make it still work for us because I don't want to push them to do more, because what if they leave? What if they, they don't want to handle that level of stress? I would rather have them here than get my needs met. Like that kind of force is not aligned with you. It's going to make you, again, break yourself in a sense. You're going to convince yourself that you don't deserve things that are easeful, that flow, that align with you naturally. And you do, you are worthy of that. But if you have that deep belief, that self-limiting belief of, anything worthwhile is not easy, or anything that I genuinely want, that is for me, I have to change myself, or I have to really push, or I have to really force, you're not going to be acting in ways that are truly easeful for you and that are actually authentic to you, right? And that is key, this authenticity, right? Because when it comes to the resistance I was talking about earlier, the things you have to do to push through that resistance to get to the other side of it, to get to the thing that you actually want, it's still authentic to you. It's just that you're scared to step into that level of authenticity because, whatever self-limiting belief is there, right? I don't want to be seen because to be seen means to be judged or criticized because maybe that's how you were raised, right? But to be seen is authentic to you. You want to be seen because you want to be recognized for what you're doing. That is authentic to you, but there's that level of fear and resistance there because of these conditioned beliefs, right? On the other hand, though, when you are faced with resistance that requires you to push through it by not being authentic, by placating, by people pleasing, by changing the way you show up, or trying to accommodate the other person more than you accommodate yourself, it's not meant to be. Like, it's not meant to be. And it's okay. And this is, I think, the hardest part of this. Acceptance. Acceptance that this is just not aligned. And I know that's really difficult because if you tie your worth to these things, which so many of us do, and there's no shame to that. It's just human nature in a sense. And also, again, conditioning, right? If you've been conditioned to tie your worth and value to the way other people perceive you or your success in certain circumstances, then it'll be hard to accept that this thing that you've been striving for just isn't aligned, and to make it a neutral thing, not make it something that's rooted in your self-worth. So if we go back to the example of a relationship, right? You meet somebody, you hit it off, it's going well, but you know what? You're noticing some issues between the two of you. You're noticing a little bit of discrepancy there. You're noticing just not as much flow as you would like in a dynamic. Accepting that, oh, okay, this is just not aligned, or it's aligned up until this point, but I want to go further because this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a partner who I can, whatever that is for you, whatever your intention is. And intention is really important too. But accepting that, yeah, it's not aligned, and the way they're showing up has nothing to do with me and my worth, and has everything to do with them. That's just who they are. And we are not aligned. We are different entities in this moment. And that's okay. It's okay. And to not have to force yourself to fit that person as though they are somehow more in the right than you are, right? It's like convincing yourself that this person, the way they're living life, the way they're showing up is more right than me. And this, ties into having a self-worth wound, of course, not feeling good enough. So everybody else is better than you. So that means how they show up must be the right way to show up. So I should bend and mold myself to fit into how they're showing up, but neglecting my own needs in the process. Even though I want to show up a certain way, they're not showing up that way. I'm still going to abandon myself to show up for them. Like, no, you're going to break yourself doing that. If you have to force it, if you have to not be you, if you have to not be aligned with your values and just the way you want to be as a person, you're going to break it. And break yourself, meaning not be able to trust yourself anymore, not be able to show yourself that you are worthy as you are, to, care for yourself, care for your inner child, or you will break the relationship, right? You will break the way it functions because there's going to be a lot of resentment on your part, right? On the one hand, and also it just won't be an enjoyable relationship if you feel like you always have to act a certain way and that person's not showing up fully in the way that you need them. It's just not going to be fun. It's not going to be easy and flowy. And what's the point of that, right? Truly. So if it's not aligned, if it's not flowing, it might just not be meant to work. And that's okay. And accepting that it's not working and it has nothing to do with you or nothing to do with them either. It doesn't have to mean that they are an awful person. Take the narratives out of it, right? Use neutrality to make this an easy process for you in order to accept and let go. Because that's the point, right? If you don't have neutrality, if there is some sort of narrative of this person's good, this person's bad, it'll make it harder to accept what's happening, and you will end up trying to cling to this belief or this truth or this narrative, right? If you feel like you're not good enough, you're going to try to cling to make them feel better for you and try to make it work with them because they are better than you, right? Or on the other hand, if you feel like they're bad, they're awful people, you're going to live in this mindset and mentality that doesn't quite feel good, right? It's always going to feel like it's you against the world or you against them. And it doesn't have to be that way. It just doesn't flow. It's just not aligned, and that's okay. Not everybody is meant to align with you, right? And that's a sad reality to accept as well, especially, again, as a people pleaser, because you've been conditioned to think, I have to make everyone like me. I have to make everyone aligned with me because I need to feel safe. If people don't like me, if I'm not aligned with everyone, I'm not going to be safe. That's important to deconstruct, right? Because it's going to make you try to force things to work that just don't work, and it's okay. And you will be safe. But it's about showing yourself and your inner child as an adult version now that you are safe with yourself, that you're not going to abandon yourself to make it work with someone or something that doesn't flow. That's how you make yourself feel safe, ultimately, right? So I hope this was helpful. I hope it was informative. If you want to work with me one-to-one and talk about this concept in more detail, feel free to book a call with me. I have a Substack where I write about these things, and you can find all my socials and follow me in the link below. But thank you for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another episode.